Now, we are coming to the close, really, of the philosophical section of studying and understanding Marxism. And really, from materialism, now Marx extracts a methodology of looking at history. And arguably, one of the earliest statements and one of the most well-known statements that he makes in this regard is here a preface of a contribution to critique of political economy. As I already emphasized earlier, Marx had begun to move towards political economy to try and understand how history moves forward. And he writes this himself. He says, "The first work which I undertook to dispel the doubts assailing me was a critical re-examination of the Hegelian philosophy of law. My inquiry led me to the conclusion that neither legal relations nor political forms could be comprehended whether by themselves or on the basis of a so-called general development of the human mind, but that on the contrary they originate in the material conditions of life, the totality of which Hegel, following the example of the English and French thinkers of the 18th century, embraces within the term civil society." Yani, you have to examine civil society. You have to examine the rest of society to understand how politics is working, how ideas are functioning. That the anatomy of this civil society, however, has to be sought in political economy. So having looked at this philosophical debate that was raging between the materialists on the one hand and the idealists on the other hand, Marx says that I came to the conclusion that to really understand how human ideas develop, you have to understand political economy. And that's what he started to do. That's how he developed dialectical materialism. Now, in this presentation, you'll see that kuch slides black mein hai. The black slides are Marx's original writing. And then I have the white slides that are my simplistic explanation of those black slides. So what is he saying? He's basically saying something very simple. He's saying that Hegel got dialectics right. That was right. The process of history moving in a dialectic, brilliant work by Hegel. What did he get wrong? What he got wrong was that he was setting it on an idealist foundation. He was thinking somehow that the unfolding of history is the unfolding of some sort of laws of logic that have existed since eternity or something. Marx argued that history unfolded in a dialectical process, he takes that from Hegel, on the basis of a materialist epistemology. He takes that from Feuerbach and the other materialists. And he synthesizes those two things together. Now, please note that all the great philosophers, whether we talk about Plato, Aristotle, or we talk about Descartes, or we talk about Kant, etc., all of them, even Hegel, all of them are actually synthesizers of their period. They look at what's happening in philosophy, they look at what's happening in political economy, or they look at what's happening in some other branch of knowledge, sciences, natural sciences, and they bring it all together. And that's really what Marx is also trying to do. He's trying to synthesize Hegelian dialectics with French materialism. Materialism, of course, is the view that all that exists is made of matter. There is only matter in the world, okay? And thought is a reflection in a material brain. There is no soul as such. There is thinking brains, but that is a organic process, a chemical and electrochemical process. Last night I was reading a very interesting book by Jonathan Israel, nothing to do with the state, Israel. It's on the Enlightenment. It's a 3-part beautiful series on the Enlightenment. He was talking about how during the Enlightenment, especially in the 18th century, scientists were doing all sorts of experiments to try and find the soul. They had different theories about. Today we don't do that anymore. We just assume that the soul is something that you cannot locate with any scientific physical process. But in the 18th century, they were actually trying to find, where is the soul located? Is it in the heart? Is it in the mind? Is it somewhere else? Is it all over? And they were doing various experiments to find it. Of course, they didn't find it. Okay? They couldn't find it. So the materialists were of the view that all our thoughts, every thought you have, are reflections on our circumstances. We are thinking about our circumstances. That's what thinking is. Objective conditions, material reality. There is nothing in our mind that comes to us from any Platonic ideal realm. Everything we know about the world, we acquire through our experience. In that sense, epistemologically speaking, Marx is very close to the empiricists. Okay? Everything you know about the world, how did you learn it? You learnt it from your experience. Even religion, therefore, is man's own reflection on nature as well as on humanity, on society, on history. religion also is formed out of our own experiences of reflecting on our society. This is a very different view of religion from the criticism of religion that we often encounter amongst sort of certain kinds of, I don't know what to call them, liberal rationalists or whatever, who regard all of religion as merely some sort of irrationality. We can think of Richard Dawkins as an example of someone who takes that kind of position. That's not Marx's position. Marx's position is religion is basically human beings reflecting on their own condition. That's all there is. And how you reflect on your conditions is determined by what kind of society you have, what kind of life you have, what kind of material processes you are engaged in, what kind of social relations you have created. And all of that depends on the kind of society you have built based on the productive forces. So that's how he looks at the process of development. He says, he now constructs a kind of pyramid. He says, in the social production of their life. Why does he say the social production of their life? Because life is produced socially. Man is a social animal. Nobody lives on their own. Life is produced through coming together in many different ways, partly, of course, for reproduction, but partly also, of course, for production. We all live, human beings, not as atoms living separately from each other, but in relationships with each other. So in the social production of their life, men enter into definite relations that are indispensable. You can't do without working together, and independent of their will. These relations that are formed are not formed out of somebody's brain saying, oh, we should do it this way or whatever. No, no. They are formed out of the conditions of life that people have to deal with. So it's in that sense that those relations that develop are independent of your will. To give you an example, if you are born in the desert and you are a desert people, you will have to find some way to get shelter from the sunlight. You will have to find and preserve water. You will have to find a way to ensure that the heat does not kill you and that the sparseness of agricultural production, you have to deal with that. You have to find sources of water and food and everything. You just have to deal with that. It's independent of your will. It's the circumstances that have been bequeathed to you, given to you by nature. And as you change those natural circumstances, then those changed circumstances become the circumstances that are just given to you. They are bequeathed to you. Okay? You can change those circumstances, but the circumstances that you are changing are already in existence, independent of your will. So these relations of production correspond to a definite stage of development of their material productive forces. So what stage of society and development are you at? Productive forces se kya murad hui? Just your capacity and ability to produce. What is production? Production is a deliberate human activity whose purpose is to alter the metabolism with nature in such a way so that mankind benefits, humanity benefits from nature. So we are able to take more grain from nature. We're able to we're able to extract water from nature. We're able to get shade from nature and so on. So it's a relationship between man and nature. By man, I mean, in German, by the way, the word man is gender neutral. Okay, it's not, doesn't mean male. Okay. So it is a relationship between humanity and nature. Production is a deliberate attempt by humanity through work, through labor, to alter the metabolism between nature and man in such a way as to benefit us. That's very clear. And our ability and capacity to do that is what we refer to as productive forces. If you wrote, for example, technology or overall technological level, overall know-how, overall scientific knowledge, that's all correct. That's what it is. Now, the sum total of these relations of production constitute the economic structure of society. So, given the level of productive forces, you have to enter into certain relations. Those relations are determined by the situation, by the circumstances, by the objective conditions. And those relations, if you put them all together, all the relations, you put them together, what do you get? You get the economic basis of society. This is such an interesting way to define economics. It's not the way we think of economics when we do economics in the economics department. When we do economics, we always talk, what do we talk about? We talk about scarcity of goods and services and unlimited wants. But we never actually address that the economic system is not about things. No. It's not about stuff. No. What is the economic system? It's actually human relationships. We come into relationships with each other when we produce. Though, like for example, there are staff members here in LUMS who are responsible for making sure that you have clean floors. There are staff members responsible for making sure that the washrooms are clean. There are other members responsible for mowing the lawns. There are other members responsible for making sure that security is provided. We have a relationship with them even though we don't talk to them. We may or may not talk to them, insofar as they are laying the objective conditions for everything that is happening in this classroom. That is our relationship with them. If they did not do all of those things, the things that you are doing over here and that I'm doing over here would actually not be possible. We don't think about economics in that way, but that really is what economics is, says Marx. At the end of the day, it is the relationships we build in society between people in the act of production. Now, I may have a relationship with you which is separate from production. Okay? So you may be my friend. We may like to hang out and have coffee. Is that a relations of production? No, that's a friendship. But if we enter into an economic relationship, you work for me, or the work that you do is something that I benefit from, now that's a different kind of relationship, even though we may not talk to each other. So in that sense, we don't think of relationships. We only think of relationships in the sense of people talking to each other. But we are also in a relationship if I'm using the products that you are creating. And those are the social relationships that create the economy. So on this basis, he says, this economic system, which he refers to as the mode of production, arises a legal and political superstructure. In other words, the laws of society are based on these relationships that we form in the act of production. The kind of state that is created and formed is formed on the basis of these relationships that we already have entered into. Uski bunyad pe laws of property और सब कुछ ये चीजें develop होती. That is the superstructure of society, in which is included politics and the legal system, the state, the media, all of these other things. And then on top of that, what do you have? And to which correspond the definite forms of social consciousness. उसके ऊपर क्या है? उसके ऊपर है ideology, ideas, religion, philosophy, everything that we study here at LUMS, our social morality, all of these things, the incredibly abstract ideas that are right at the pinnacle, that are at the top of what? Uske niche hai the state and the actual superstructure. Uske niche kya hai? The economic system that we are all part of, the relations we have entered into in the act of production. Uske niche kya hai? Our relationship with nature, the productive forces of humanity. This is the pyramid that he constructs. He says this is what you have to understand. It's not that one or another part of this pyramid is more important than the other part, because the whole thing is a Hegelian, like a Hegelian organism. It will always inevitably move together. If the economic base changes, the superstructure has to change. It cannot be otherwise in the longer view of history. Of course, in changing it, it may occur in spasms and dialectically and so on. But it is an organic whole. That is what society is. Our thoughts, the superstructure, our economic relations, and our relationship with nature, all of it is joined together in this particular Hegelian dialectic. So let's have these terms simplified. Productive forces, of course, our understanding of nature, our capacity to produce, to put it very simply, to alter our relationship with nature in our benefit. What are the relations of production? These are the relations we enter into with each other in the process of production. And property is the legal name for relations of production. And what is the mode of production? It is basically the economic system. It's Marx's word for the economic system. This could be feudalism, this could be capitalism, this could be socialism, or whatever else. And it is made up, Marx says, of the sum total of all the relations of production. Put together all the relations of production, all the human relationships that we have entered into in the process of production. That's your your real economic system, not the one we draw on the board. That's just our understanding of it. But the real economic system is our relationships with each other. And what is the means of production? That's just another name for all the things we use to produce. Okay? That would include raw materials, it would include all economic resources, mother nature, tools, instruments, machines, everything. Everything aside from human labor power. When human labor power and means of production come together, that's when production takes place. So Marx writes, the mode of production of material life conditions the social, political, and intellectual life process. In general, it is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness. It is the material conditions at the end of the day that determine what kind of relations of production they create, which in turn determine what kind of superstructure they have, and which in turn determines what kind of what kind of ideas, social consciousness they have. And of course, all of this is in a relationship with each other. So it's not like he's saying, okay, it's a one-way street or something. But the way in which the relationship works is that it's not a random process. It's not like somebody can get up whenever they want to and create any kind of society that they would like to create. Okay, just because you have a great idea about how society ought to be, like you're Thomas More and you say it should be a utopia, it should be like this, doesn't mean that that's how things can happen. You may have a great idea, but you have to see whether that idea accords with the conditions of that society. If it does, people will accept that idea and history will move forward with that idea. If it doesn't, people will just ignore your idea because they'll say, that's not just totally impractical, but why would we want that? You see? So the ideas impact society, develop, they are reflecting on the given society, and they impact that society, but they can only impact that society in the measure that they solve some real contradiction of that society. So the key variable here, of course, is labor. Labor now comes into the center of his analysis, because material reality consists first and foremost of what? Of labor, not of infinite wants and satisfying infinite wants from limited resources. No. Economics में सबसे बड़ी mistake in the definition of economics. You know, I used to be an economics teacher before I switched to political economy, etc., and political science and political philosophy. I taught economics for many years at the Lahore School of Economics. I was an econ professor. So one of the major mistakes of economics is exactly that if you read any economics A-level, O-level textbook, it starts by saying what? That economics is a study of the allocation of scarce resources amongst unlimited wants. But you know, the most essential question of economics here is completely not in that definition, which is what? Which is economic activity is about production. And production is about human labor. The whole of human labor is taken out of that definition, and what are you left with? Only the question of consumption, which itself is actually only half the picture, because you can't consume what you do not produce. So actually, economics is about the study, in my view, of how humans come together to produce, what kind of social relations they create in order to produce. So humanity must labor to appropriate or produce the means of subsistence. Obviously, without subsistence, man cannot exist at all. Hence, production and also reproduction, birth of new children, is really the basis of all life. It is through collective labor that we form social relations. We come together, we work together, and we create social relations. These are called relations of production, and these relations of production are not random. They are formed in accordance with the given material conditions and have a deep influence on everything that we do. In fact, economics didn't start out that way. Economics was a very, very diverse, very interesting field. It was actually called, it was not even called economics, it was called political economy by Adam Smith and by Ricardo and by Say and by so many others. I've taught a course on the history of economic thought, a very diverse field, going all the way back to Aristotle and the Greeks, in fact. And then after Ricardo, there was a reaction that set into economics, because Ricardo's theory already pointed the way towards socialism. Although Ricardo himself is not a socialist, but the labor theory of value as developed by Ricardo very easily lent itself to a socialist point of view. If everything is created by labor, if labor is the basis of value, then to labor belong all the fruits of that work. So by Robertus's time, etc., there was a reaction setting in the 1870s. And then there was the attempt to develop what is called the Austrian school, the subjectivist theory of value, which was a non-starter. It actually could not get off the ground. It was actually a very poor theory. And then came Alfred Marshall at the turn of the century and wrote his famous book, Principles of Economics. And from that point onwards, that became the standard thing that we study. Today, we basically study Alfred Marshall. Marshall now tries to bring the labor theory of value as well as the subjective theory of value together. And we study it, and we are concerned so much about the graphs, etc., that we don't realize how many theoretical blunders actually exist even in basic level economics. We don't realize it, but there are many. Some people do. Like even the utility theory, etc., has enormous blunders in it. It's something that you can never, for instance, verify empirically. There's no way that you can verify it, because the only way you can predict utility, I've said this many times, is by what you call revealed preference. But revealed preference was supposed to be explained by utility. Now utility is being explained by revealed preference. This is classic circular logic. Okay? Actually, you're not explaining anything at all. But anyway, don't get me started on economics, because it's my pet peeve, and I'll go on. But this, in my view, is it's a much deeper understanding of economics as social relations and as a relationship of humanity to nature, and therefore also it is a relationship of humanity to each other in the process of working to change nature. And for that reason, I think this understanding of, starting from here, this understanding of economics is far superior to that question which is restricted to a very small question actually, which is only the question of consumption. Infinite wants and scarce resources, just about consumption. It's not even actually about production. So, now we come to the dialectic of history. Marx writes, at a certain stage of their development, the material productive forces of society come in conflict with the existing relations of production. Zara gaur se sunni baat. Material productive forces, our know-how, our capacity to produce, come into conflict with what? With our relations, our capacity to produce increases and increases, and suddenly we find that the way in which we are working is not satisfactory in relation to what? In relation to our capacity to produce. Our capacity to produce has increased, and the way we are working is now outdated. The relations we have are outdated, and actually we could produce a lot more and a lot better if we change the way we relate to each other in the process of production. He says this conflict comes about in history. As productive forces expand, they come into conflict with this economic system. Knowledge comes into conflict with our system, the system we have created. Or what is but a legal expression for the same thing, in other words, property relations. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations of production, yani the economic system, turn into their fetters. The very system that pushed society forward, moved society forward, developed society, now becomes a system that holds society back. And society more and more can feel that. What is this chart I have made here for you? This is a timeline of world history, starting from here and moving all the way till here. If you want a grand view of history, here it is. Why do societies and social systems change over time? They change over time because new ways of doing work are created. New ways of relating to nature are created. And they come into contradiction with the way in which we have been working in the past. There are many examples that we can give you. So if I were to ask you this question, what is the central dialectic of history? You remember that for Hegel, it was, of course, the idea getting to know itself. But for Marx, what is it? It is this. Productive forces develop progressively, slowly, over time, within the context of certain relations of production. Okay? That is the mode of production or the economic system in its totality. Okay? All the relations of production is the economic system, i.e. the mode of production. Usme wo develop ho rahe. At one point, the relations of production become out of date and can no longer develop the productive forces further. This causes society to stagnate, and people can feel that stagnation. They can see that there is a better way to organize society, and yet we're not organizing it that way. There's some other way to organize it. A crisis sort of emerges. A social revolution is needed to overthrow these relations of production and create a new economic system. That is the central dialectic of history, the contradiction between the developing productive forces and the relations of production. And we see this play out in the class struggle. We see this play out as social revolutions. He says, then begins an epoch of social revolutions. एक पूरा period शुरू हो जाता है in which there are just revolutions happening all the time. With the change of the economic foundations of the entire immense superstructure is more or less rapidly transformed. When the economic base transforms, the superstructure is transformed. The old ideas go out of date. They are thrown away. New ideas come into being. In considering such transformations, a distinction should always be made between the material transformation, yani the economic transformation of the economic conditions of production, which can be determined with the precision of natural science. That you can figure out like natural science. You can have the data. और दूसरी तरफ क्या है? And the legal, political, religious, aesthetic or philosophical relations, etc. Those changes are harder to figure out because you can't do them like natural science. In short, ideological forms in which men become conscious of this conflict and fight it out. Just as our opinion of an individual is not based on what he thinks of himself, so can we not judge of such a period of transformation by its own consciousness. When these transformations are happening, new societies are created, don't use their own consciousness to understand that society. That's an important element, but that's not the sole element. On the contrary, now hear this is very important. This consciousness must be explained rather from the contradictions of material life. The new ideas that are generated, the old ideas that are dying down, the conflict of ideas has to be explained how? It has to be explained by understanding what is the material conflict actually about. What is the conflict about in society? Who are the social classes? What are they fighting about? What is the real issue between them? This consciousness must be explained rather from the contradictions of material life, from the existing conflict between the social productive forces and the relations of production. That's how you will really understand it. Think of an example where the Eastern Church, Greek Orthodox Church, separated from the Roman Catholic Church. And the Bazahir conflict was over bread. How should you serve the holy bread, etc. Can you imagine? Why would that be such a big deal? But that was one of the big fights. What Marx is explaining to you is, no. The conflict over the bread is not about the bread. It's actually about something much wider between the two churches and between the East and the West, etc. You have to understand what is their social interests that are manifested in the issue over the bread. There are many religious conflicts of this sort. When you separate yourself from that society, you'll say, what are you fighting about? What's the big deal? Etc. But then when you get into what is happening in society at a deeper level, you begin to understand that that is just symbolic of a much larger struggle that's going on between various people. And that is class struggle. So society is made up of classes. A class is a group of people with a common relationship to the means of production. And in any society, there are those who control economic resources and obviously those who don't. And the legal form of this control over resources is called property. And hence, classes are defined by ownership of property. When do social revolutions occur? So Marx says, no social order has ever perished before all the productive forces for which there is room in it have developed. The system has to be exhausted in its capacity to deliver before people overthrow it. If it's still growing, if it's still developing, if it's still giving you more than you had before, then people will stick to it. People are conservative that way. And never appears, and new higher relations of production never appear before the material conditions of their existence have matured in the womb of the old society itself. The new system cannot come about till the conditions have been created, the material conditions. Therefore, mankind always sets itself only such tasks as it can solve. Since looking at the matter more closely, it will always be found that the task itself arises only when the material conditions of its solution already exist or are at least in the process of formation. The fact that we may be discussing what to do about capitalism is itself, he says, indicative of the fact that we are more and more feeling that capitalism is unable to solve the fundamental issues and that there could be a better system than that. And that's how class struggles then emerge. New classes take power, social systems change, ideology and politics undergoes an entire revolution. All of this, of course, reflects what is happening in society at a more general level between the various classes as a relationship between nature and relationship between each other. So that is how the dialectical movement of history occurs as a result of the contradiction between forces of production and relations of production manifested in the class struggle. okay? And in broad outlines, Marx says this is what we can see. We can see the Asiatic mode of production, that was the first one. Then we see the ancient mode of production, that was the Greco-Roman civilization. Then we see the feudal mode of production, and then the capitalist mode of production. He says you can call them progressive epochs in the economic formation of society. As society as history, human history has gone forward, you see these systems arise. Each one, develops, is a further development from the last. The bourgeois relations of production, the last antagonistic form of social process of production. What does he mean by antagonistic? Antagonistic not in the sense of individual antagonism. Yes, we have individual differences. He's not talking about that. But of one arising from the social conditions of life of the individuals. At the same time, the productive forces developing in the womb of bourgeois society create the material conditions for the solution of that antagonism. This social formation brings, therefore, the prehistory of society to a close. The antagonistic mode of production is one in which there are classes fighting with each other, opposed to each other, etc. He says this is the last form of class society that we see. We see class society develop since the agricultural revolution, and the capitalist form of production is the last type of that society that we are going to witness. These are the periods of history: primitive communism, Asiatic mode of production, ancient society, feudal society, capitalist society. Primitive communism is basically from the beginning of mankind till the agricultural revolution. You had people who were organized into lots of tribes. They had leaders, of course. They had a hierarchy, but there was no class antagonism. These are societies without classes as such. Then you have the earliest states that are formed, that are class societies. You also have the beginning of patriarchy at this period. This is the Asiatic mode of production, and it first develops in China, in India, in Persia, Babylon, Egypt, etc. Right? And this goes on for a long time. There is communal private ownership of land. What does that mean? It means the land is not owned by one person. It is owned by a tribe as a community, but that tribe owns it as its private property. Other tribes are not allowed there, etc. Right? That's what it means. And in India, he says this developed into the caste system. Then you have the Greco-Roman civilization, which starts with Greece in the 6th century BCE and lasts till the 5th century AD. It rested on slavery, on chattel slavery, making other people slaves. It, of course, perfected patriarchy even further. Greeks, by the way, and Romans are the most patriarchal civilization you can ever think of, okay? Much, much, much more than the Muslims ever were, okay? Don't make the mistake of thinking that is not the case. And he says it reached its highest point with Rome. And in fact, we get the term really from that period. Then next up, from the 5th century till the 9th century, we see the development of feudal society. It reaches its high point in France, in the feudal society, and continues all the way through till the 16th century when the modern period begins. It rested on serfdom, the king, the lord, the manor, etc., the fief, etc., and had a whole system of landlords, serfs, guildmasters, journeymen, apprentices, and so on. And this is the period in which Christianity dominated over Europe. In other words, that was the superstructure of the entire feudal system. And now we have capitalism, which has started out from the 16th century, but now has come to dominate the globe. In the 16th century, it was just like a germ in society. It just begun, and it grew and grew and grew. And in the French Revolution, it took exclusive political power. It's based on wage, labor, and capital. Its dominant ideology are two forms: nationalism on the one side and liberalism on the other side, liberal democracy on the other side. And he says it's the final stage in the development of private property or the development of classes. We will discuss that later. Why is this the final stage? Why not some other final stage, etc.? Well, mainly because he says competition leads to monopoly and creates a vast working class, a proletariat organized into modern industry, which will overthrow capitalism and create socialism.